The Second World War had a number of different paramilitary and resistance movements throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. They were primarily used for propaganda against the nation currently occupying their homeland, sabotaging enemy equipment and occupied infrastructure, and in many cases, actively engaging in armed combat against occupying soldiers. One of the more well-known groups was the Polish Underground State and the Polish Resistance. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to what can only be described as the one video I make every fucking millennia, I don't know, and the proper second installment of what I am dubbing the Brief History Saga series. Fuck, the first part of the series was going over the Nazi Reichskommissariats, which I will leave both in the description and as a pop-up in the corner of this video if I can figure out how to do so by the time I actually get around to editing and uploading this. I will add that, just like the last video, everything was done by myself. Researching, scripting, recording, editing, all that, it's all solo work. I ain't got money to pay people. To Key's very immense dismay. All that being said, there will most likely be some inaccuracies to an extent scattered throughout here, but I tried my best to narrow them down as much as I possibly could. Going with the same makeup of the Reichskommissariat video, as well as my fond love for very crude humor. Today's video will be both informative, but while also containing some probably pretty dark jokes at times. That is, whenever I can find a chance to throw one in there. Throughout the video, I will primarily go over the following aspects: the origin of the Polish Underground State and Resistance, or the Polish acronym, the PPP, its civilian and military layouts, basically how it ran, the different primary ideologies within it, major activities and resistance actions performed and carried out by the PPP throughout the war, and famous members or individuals of the resistance, be it the PPP itself or maybe another small little ragtag group of guys or something that happened to carry out or take part in notable events. Before I begin, I would also like to add, there will be many fucked up attempts at speaking Polish throughout this video. Background and origins. The Second Polish Republic was invaded by Nazi Germany on September 1st, 1939, with Fall Weiss, with the USSR following suit on the 17th. The Polish nation was divided in half by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, giving the West to Berlin, who directly occupied the northern and western regions, whereas the central and southern areas like Warsaw and Krakow were incorporated into the General Government Reichskommissariat. The east was controlled by Moscow, who enlarged the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs until Operation Barbarossa, when the Reichskommissariats Ostland and Ukraine were created on top of the expansion of the General Government. The Polskie Państwo Podziemie, or the Polish Underground State, originated out of the Służba Żywostu Polski, or the Service for Poland's Victory. It was formalized on September 27th, one day before the fall of the Polish capital Warsaw on September 28th. Led by General Michael Karasiewicz Tokarzewski, the SZP was the first proper resistance movement in Poland during the war. The original intention was to liberate Poland from the inside out. In November 1939, it would be changed to the Związek Walki Zbrojnej, or the Union of Armed Struggle, until another name change, becoming the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, in February 1942. The SCP's first order of business, initially after its creation, was to get Polish opposition parties to work with one another to make the PPP run effectively and efficiently while Poland itself was still under occupation. The initial leadership consisted of three political parties: the Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, the Stronnictwo Ludowe, and the Stronnictwo Narodowe. The exiled Polish government had formalized the ZWZ by the end of November and built it around the same style of organization network as the SCP. It was described as universal, national, non-party, and non-class, and every Polish citizen willing to fight against their German and Soviet occupiers were considered members regardless of race, beliefs, or anything of the sort. Colonel Stefan Rowecki was made the commanding officer of the ZWZ in lands held by Germany, whereas Tokarzewski was put in charge of the Soviet branch. This would only last a few months, however, as Tokarzewski would be arrested and held by the NKVD in March 1940 until being placed in command of a Soviet-led Polish infantry division upon the start of Operation Barbarossa. He would survive the war and die in Casablanca, Morocco in 1964. The ZWZ was also deemed a secret military organization based on strict principles of hierarchy and discipline. All members were required to take an oath to the group, where they would swear to serve the organization and maintain its secrecy. The head council also called for all other paramilitary groups within Poland to align themselves with the ZWZ. The head council was later enlarged with the addition of Poland's Partia Prasy, and it was renamed to the Polityczny Komitet Porozumieniawczy, or the Political Coordinating Committee. The leader of the PPS, Kazimierz Puziak, was elected as committee chairman on February 26, 1940. The head council had been set up in Angers, France, a city about 300 kilometers from Paris. And for those of you who will use literally anything but the metric system, approximately 98,033 Ford F-150s. America. After France fell in June 1940, the council fled to London. They also established the supreme command of the ZWZ in Poland itself, with General Rowecki as commander-in-chief. He would oversee and personally lead all official paramilitary action within Poland. At the same time, the government in exile also formed the Ministerial Committee for Homeland Affairs, with the intent to evenly split up military and civilian authorities, such that they won't overlap one another. Whereas the chief government delegate was made to administer political and administrative issues. The person in this position would work with the different party representatives in the PKP to deal with more political matters than the rest of the group. Back on the ground, many volunteer groups were set up within the first few months of the war under the general command of Major Henryk Hubal Dobrzański, although these were largely unorganized and ineffective in the grand scheme of things. But they did inflict some good damage at times, such as in March to April of 1940, when Dobrzański and his men in the detached unit of the Polish army made many successful ambushes against German forces in the southern general government. Eventually, the ZWZ ordered him to disband his units, as the German reprisals against civilians in the region worried the ZWZ that they may be unable to effectively recruit new members. But Dobrzański refused the order. Hubal will die in battle on April 30th, 1940, in a ravine near the town of Opoźno in what is today the Łódź Voivodeship. After his death, Hubal's men continued to fight until June 25th, when they were disbanded. Layout. I also just realized that I forgot to put on my prop for today's video. We got a, Cold War Polish helmet. It's not World War II Poland, but it's still Poland, so in my eyes, it counts, at the very least for this. The resistance movements in Poland were closely intertwined in many ways, but vastly different in others. Thus, they were not all managed in exactly the same way. While most resistance groups and activities were under the general watch of the ZWZ, or AK, and government in exile, some, however, chose to carve their own path of defiance. One of the greatest examples of this is the Narodowa Organizacja Wojskowa, or the National Military Organization, aligned with the NS. While not a direct part of the ZWZ or its derivatives, the NOW did recognize the government in exile in London as the legitimate Polish government. The organization split in 1942 into 1943, with one branch merging with the AK, while the other reformed into the Narodowe Siły Zbrojne, or the National Armed Forces, which would target both German and Soviet units, as well as communist or communist sympathizing Poles within their own ranks and those of other resistance groups. This branch mainly consisted of partisans that did not recognize the government in exile, and some members would actively cooperate with the Nazis, mainly when anti-Semitism was involved. But these acts were, in most cases, frowned upon, and those involved were punished. The NSZ would later be partially incorporated into the AK after the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, while the rest formed the Narodowe Zjednoczone Wojskowe, or National Military Union, along with former NOW members who didn't join either the AK or NSZ previously. The group would prioritize anti-Soviet resistance even after the war ended, until being dissolved in 1947. The Soviet government would deem them, as well as other anti-communist groups, cursed soldiers, and in many cases, they and their families would be persecuted by the NKVD and KGB. Another semi-independent resistance network was the Związek Harcerstwa Polskiego, or Polish Scouting Association, better known by their wartime codename Szare Szeregi, or Grey Ranks. They would, on occasion, work directly with the government in exile to better coordinate their operations. Originally founded in 1910 and reformed in 1918 in the final months of World War I, the ZHP is still around today. They have just disbanded the portion that was an active resistance group. Made up mostly of Polish Boy and Girl Scouts, the organization initially only accepted membership for people 17 years of age and older, though they soon created branches that allowed children as young as 12 to enlist. The kids were not given direct combat roles, obviously, so you're not going to see little Franciszek pulling up to a brigade of Germans wielding a PPSH. Rather, the youngest branch of the Grey Ranks, named Jawisza, and consisting of children from 12 to 14 years old, were given auxiliary roles and taught how they can rebuild a post-war Poland. Children from 15 to 17 will be moved into the Bojowe Szkoły, or combat schools. Here, they would train for and carry out small-scale raids and sabotage against German forces. These include missions such as Operation Wawer Pommery, where pro-Polish and anti-German symbols and messages would be graffitied onto buildings and walls. The BS members would also be overall public nuisances to the Germans, stealing megaphones and spreading Polish propaganda with them, pulling fire alarms to interrupt important meetings and events, and even using stink bombs to interrupt movie screenings, among others. Who knew that one's intrusive thoughts mixed with very shit high school senior pranks would be used to liberate a country? After the BS came the final branch of the Grey Ranks, the Grupy Szturmowe, or the assault groups, consisting of members 17 plus the GS was the branch that would actively combat German and Soviet soldiers, as well as carry out the more dangerous espionage and sabotaging missions. They would engage troop and supply convoys, damage roads and rail tracks, help Polish prisoners break out of German confinement, and carry out execution orders given to them directly by the government in exile and the AK. The GS was under direct command of the Kierownictwo Dywizji, the AK's Directorate of Sabotage. New members would be trained in secret underground schools for motorized and engineering commanders. They would also attend underground schools used to prepare the next generation on how to rebuild the Polish nation once the war ended. Some of the most well-known GS units were Zoczka, Parasol, and Basta, among many others. Some notable acts carried out by the GS are the assassinations of key SS officers in and around Warsaw, such as SS Rottenführer Eva Lange on May 22nd, 1943, and SS und Polizeführer Franz Kuchera on February 1st, 1944. They also liberated the Geshiovka concentration camp on August 5th, 1944, in the first few days of the Warsaw Uprising. Most of the 348 freed inmates would die in combat throughout the uprising's duration. To summarize this segment, there were hundreds of different groups and organizations that would take up arms in attempts to purge the Nazis and Soviets from Polish lands. And if I went through every single one of them, we'd be here for a long-ass time. Ideologies. Polish populace was home to many different beliefs and ideals, some of which were fairly similar, whereas others were vastly different. The interwar Polish government, and subsequently the government in exile, consisted of Democrats, nationalists, socialists, communists, etc., many of whom already didn't get along very well with their colleagues. Upon the German invasion, however, the Polish people set aside their ideological obstacles, for the most part at least, and worked together to fight off the Axis. For this next segment, let's discuss a few of the more prominent political parties and figures within the many ideological bubbles of Poland in the years leading up to and during the war. For starters, the president of Poland at the start of the war was Ignacy Mościcki. Member of the PPS, Mościcki was elected on June 1st, 1926, after Marshal Józef Piłsudski's May coup. Piłsudski was elected by the Sejm on May 31st, but he declined and passed the role to Mościcki, as the two had been friends for many years. Mościcki would almost always side with Piłsudski's advice up until he died of liver cancer in 1935. Upon the marshal's death, there were three key factions vying for power of the Polish government: Mościcki and his supporters, General Edward Śmigły-Rydz, and the then Prime Minister Valery Sławik. In an attempt to remove Sławik from power, Mościcki made a pact with General Śmigły-Rydz. While Mościcki was still the president, Śmigły-Rydz was given the majority of actual government authority and power, making him the de facto leader. Sławik lost most of his influence in the Polish government and eventually resigned as prime minister on October 12th, 1935, being replaced by Marian Zindram Kościakowski. He would die by suicide on the morning of April 3rd, 1939, after shooting himself the previous evening. Mościcki resigned as president of Poland on September 17th, 1939, the same day the Soviet forces began to move into eastern Poland. He gave the role to General Bolesław Wieniawa-Długoszowski, who held the position for only a single day, being ousted by General Władysław Sikorski, with the assistance of the French government shortly after arriving in Paris via a train from Rome. Wieniawa-Długoszowski would immigrate to the U.S. after France failed to Germany, where he would try and fail to get an official role in the resistance, as Sikorski was skeptical of his ties to Marshal Piłsudski's Senation movement. After spending a couple years in New York City, he would move to Detroit, where he worked for a Polish newspaper. On April 18th, 1942, Sikorski appointed Wieniawa-Długoszowski as Minister Plenipotentiary to Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. He would move back to New York later that year and helped found the National Committee of Americans of Polish extraction, aimed at promoting the Polish cause as well as criticizing the government in exile for getting too close with the Soviets and the Allies handling over Poland's eastern territories to the USSR at the end of the war. Wieniawa-Długoszowski, having pressure from both the Allies and the Soviets coming down on him, committed suicide on July 1st, 1942, possibly by jumping off a building, but exact details on his death are speculative at best. During the war itself, the PPP had representatives from many of Poland's leading parties. The primary political branch of the resistance was the aforementioned PKP. It was formally recognized as the legal political assembly by the ZWZ in April of 1940. The PKP represented four of Poland's key parties: the aforementioned Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, the Stronnictwo Ludowe, the Stronnictwo Narodowe, and the Stronnictwo Prasy, as well as members of the Polish Catholic clergy. The PKP was reformed as the Krajowa Reprezentacja Policyjna, or the Home Political Representation, in 1943, and would change again to become the Rada Jedności Narodowej, or the Council of National Unity, in 1944. The RJN would later be expanded to include members from some of the smaller Polish parties. The RJN gave a list of their wants and demands for after the war in Okowalski Naród Polski, a manifesto published by the group. In it, the RJN asked for numerous political, economical and social reforms, including the dismemberment of and land acquisitions from Germany, specifically East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, while also retaining their eastern lands that the USSR wished to annex into the Ukrainian and Belarusian SSRs, a permanent alliance with the West, and a democratic socialist system of government with a strong parliament. As the reality of the post-war Polish nation began to set in as a Soviet puppet, the RJN seemingly no longer had any basis for its existence, formally dissolving shortly after publishing a second manifesto, Do Narodu Polskiego I Narodów Zjednoczonych, which again stated Polish war goals, the requirements to reopen relations with the USSR, and an immediate removal of all Soviet soldiers and influence from Poland. The RJN was initially led by Kazimierz Puszczak until he was tried and convicted in the Soviet Trial of the 16. Afterwards, its leadership would be passed on to other members of the organization's main commission in monthly rotations until its dissolution. Puszczak was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but was released early after an amnesty agreement in November of 1945. He chose to remain in Poland and continue to work with anti-communist groups, writing a memoir, Vyspomnienia, 1939-1945, and eventually getting arrested 2 more times in 1947 and 48 by the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, or Polish secret police. This time, he was given 10 years imprisonment, but was later reduced to only 5. However, Puszczak would die on April 30th, 1950 in a Polish prison. As mentioned previously, there were 4 primary political parties in the PPP, but what were each of these parties and what did each one stand for? Since some people are fucking insane, I feel I need to add this. Talking about political parties and historical politics is the closest to political that I will ever willingly get on camera. It does not mean that I agree or disagree with any one of them. I'm simply trying to teach about them. We good? Okay, let's go. The Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, or Polish Socialist Party, was founded in 1892 in Paris. The early PPS, as did many other Polish political groups and figures at the time, advocated for Polish independence, primarily in lands held by the Russian Empire. They also held a focus on Polish nationalism. The party developed an agenda that was seen for its time as a very progressive system, calling for a democratically led, fully sovereign Poland, equality and voting rights for all citizens, banning child labor for kids under 14 years of age, minimum wage and equal pay for both men and women, 8-hour workdays, freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, free education, progressive taxation, and support in the event of workplace injury. Membership skyrocketed after the 1905 Russian Revolution, going from just a few hundred members to over 60,000. There was a split in the party in 1908 because of the revolutionaries led by Piłsudski and the left, which was more Marxist-leaning. The revolutionary faction won out in the end, and the left merged with the Social Demokracja Królestwa Polskiego I Litwy, or the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, which broke from the PPS in 1893. The merger of the parties led to the formation of the Komunistyczna Partia Polski, or the Communist Party of Poland, in 1918. The PPS, after the formation of the Second Polish Republic, supported Piłsudski in the 1926 May coup. Eventually, however, the party began to distance itself from Piłsudski and aligned with the Centrolev coalition against him. The Marshal soon oversaw the 1931-32 Brest trials, where numerous Centrolev leaders, including PPS members, were arrested and jailed. From 1923 up until 1940, the PPS was a member party of the Labor and Socialist International. Shortly after fall Weiss, the PPS froze all large-scale activities and became known during the war as Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, Wolność, Równość, Niepodległość, or Polish Socialist Party, freedom, equality, independence. Upon the war's conclusion, the PPS-WRN reverted back to just the PPS in 1947. The next year, however, the party would suffer a third split. On one side was Prime Minister of the government in exile, Edvard Ossowska-Morawski, who wanted to form an anti-Soviet front with the PSL. On the other side was Józef Cyrankiewicz, who proposed that the PPS should align with the USSR and other Polish communists. The PSL would not join forces with Ossowska-Morawski, and he would be removed as prime minister and replaced with Cyrankiewicz. His faction would merge with the communists in 1948, dissolving the PPS. Some members would remain with the government in exile. The PPS would eventually be refounded in 1987, shortly before the collapse of European communism. Today, the PPS is part of the parliamentary coalition, the Left, with, as of 2023, no seats in the Sejm and 1 in the Senate. An estimated member count is currently unknown. The Stronnictwo Ludowe, or the People's Party, was founded in 1931 after 3 smaller parties merged together. Focusing primarily on more rural communities, the SL's main goals were agrarian and populist in nature, wanting the average citizen on lower levels of society to have a more influential vote in the government. During the war, the SL had its own parliamentary wing within the PPP, the Bataliony Chłopskie, or the Peasant Battalions, created after the ZWZ deemed for an organized fighting force for the sporadic peasant groups to be formalized within the first few months of 1941. The group was led by Franciszek Kamiński. The BCH was broken down into segments based on the layout of the voivodeships at the time, and each of them created their own groups out of their given voivodeships. These mainly consisted of two kinds of forces: the territorial militias, who would be used for preparing a nationwide peasant uprising, and the tactical units, which would be the primary fighting force in said uprising. By 1944, the BCH had approximately 160,000 members, before it was merged with the Home Army in the summer. However, a small number of members joined the Red Army as they began to move back into eastern Poland. It was formally dissolved in September of 1945, shortly after the end of the war. As for the SL itself, it briefly returned to Polish government, but was mostly snuffed out in the 1947 elections, which had severe manipulation by the Soviets and Polish communists. It is believed that, had this rigging of the election not happened, that the PSL would most likely have won. Out of fear that he would be targeted by the communists, party leader and former prime minister of the government in exile, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, fled the country soon after the election concluded, and the remainder of his party would be merged with the Zjednoczone Stronnictwo Ludowe, or the United People's Party, in 1949. PSL would reform in 1990, shortly after the fall of communism. It currently has around 73,000 members and holds 28 seats in the Sejm and 4 in the Senate. The third party in the PPP was the Stronnictwo Narodowe, or the National Party. Founded in 1928 by Roman Dmowski, the SN was the offspring of the Związek Narodowy, or the Popular National Union that came before it, dissolving on the same day that the NS was established after being heavily repressed by Piłsudski's government. It was one of the main supporters of national democracy, a movement consisting of, well, nationalism and democracy. Shocker. The party followed many nationalistic and conservative viewpoints. It was heavy on Christian nationalism, promoting Catholic influence in the Polish school system. It also subscribed to anti-Masonry, anti-communism, and in some cases, anti-Semitism. Similar to a lot of other nations across Europe, many Poles began to move towards more right-wing followings as the Great Depression began to take its toll across the continent. This large influx caused the membership in the NS to rise sharply, reaching 200,000 official members by 1933, and another 1,000 who weren't direct members but did sympathize with the party. They would maintain approximately around this number until the eve of World War II. Rifts began to form in the NS in the early 1930s between the younger generations of members and the older members. It escalated when Dmowski handed control of the Obóz Wielkie Polski, or Camp of Great Poland, over to the younger leaders. By 1934, both sides debated with one another about whether to maintain the path of Dmowski and his ideals, or to change course and act separately from Dmowski while still keeping the same general premise. Due to this, as well as other differences between the two sides, the NS had a number of members split off and form their own separate groups, such as the Związek Młodzież Nacjonalistów, or the Union of Young Nationalists, and the Obóz Narodowo-Radykalny, or the National Radical Camp. The ONR was banned after just 2 months and its leaders imprisoned, leading to severe radicalization between the younger generations. The SN underwent a change of leadership in late 1937, with Chairman Joachim Bartoszewicz, Dmowski's associate, being replaced by Tadeusz Bilecki, who himself was replaced by Kazimierz Kowalski in October, with the permission of Dmowski, of course. Bilecki was a member of the older generations, and Kowalski the younger. As such, even more cracks were formed, this time over how to go about dealing with the Senation government now that the NS were among the largest opposition parties in the country. Despite not being the chairman any longer than a few months, the pro-Bilecki side had a number of advantages. For one, Kowalski was seen as being too fanatical in how he approached certain issues. Bilecki also had the education advantage, with both a master's degree in law and doctorate in Polish studies, whereas Kowalski seemingly had none, as I was unable to find any information anywhere that stated he did, or what they were if they did exist. Finally, in June 1939, Kowalski and his entire cabinet resigned, creating a power vacuum. Initially recommending Committee Secretary Zygmunt Berezovsky, Bilecki was soon chosen to once again be chairman of the party on the 25th. During the struggle between Bilecki and Kowalski, Roman Dmowski, the founder of the SN, died on January 2nd, 1939, of a combination of complications from a stroke he suffered in early 1937 and pneumonia he contracted shortly after Christmas of '38. The SN continued to work mostly in unison, despite the generational rifts in the months leading up to the Nazi invasion. Large portions of the party, especially the younger generations, came to despise the more left-wing parties and figures of the government upon learning of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This hatred fueled the party and encouraged the two halves to come together to fight against the left. Bilecki was sent to join up with an army unit on August 20th, possibly with the intent that the government could use the inevitable war to help keep the head of the SN, now the biggest opposition party, out of the political sphere for the time being. Upon the kickoff of the war itself, the party adopted a resolution stating that Poland is not alone in their fight, and that, one way or another, Germany will fall and all of Poland's rightful land will be reunited with the nation. It was around this time that, since he was unable to run a political front while on the front lines, Pilecki handed over party control to Mieczysław Trajdos. He would lead the party in exile from occupied Poland until being arrested and executed by decapitation on July 7th, 1942 in Poznan. Bobalski met his fate around the same time, being shot by the Gestapo in early March in the small village of Zegers. During the war, the SN was highly integrated in the political runnings of the government in exile, leading up to Trajdos' execution when it was without a leader until Pilecki managed to reach London and return as chairman. The party had thousands of members within the ranks of the AK, and had a larger degree of oversight over the budgetary matters of it, allowing a direct link between the government in London and the fighters all across Poland itself. The party, despite the war going on and the older and younger generations coming closer together to lead in semi-unison, still had factions within that were not fully working with the main groups. A prime example of this would be the previously mentioned ONR, which still claims a member count in the thousands despite being banned back in 1934. The organization itself was split into two main factions prior to and during the war. These were the Grupa Janka and the Ruch Narodowo-Radykalny, or the Radical National Movement, sometimes also referred to as the Falanga. Originally consisting primarily of the younger generations, the more fanatical members grew dissatisfied with the direction that their less extreme counterparts were wanting the group to take. So they split off in 1935 and established the RNR, separate from the non-extreme half of the ONR, while still remaining as part of the ONR itself. Those who did not choose to break off and stayed with the main ONR founded the ONR ABC, which admittedly I was not able to find nearly as much information on them compared to the RNR, but I'll use what I can. Probably the main difference outside of the ABC and the RNR, outside of the difference in extremism obviously, was how they believed the leadership role should be implemented, both within the organization as well as the Polish nation as a whole. The ABC wished for a committee of multiple people to run the organization and its actions, whereas the RNR believed that a single supreme ruler should lead, as they thought that a collection of figures would only cause conflict amongst each other, making the committee's grip inefficient. Heading the RNR was Bolesław Piasecki, who doubled as a founder of the base ONR. The ONR ABC committee included a number of notable figures, such as Henryk Rossman, Wojciech Zaleski, and Tadeusz Gudzinski, among many others. Rossman is seen today as the main founder and leader of the faction in its first few years, until he was assassinated in 1937 by a Ukrainian nationalist. Outside of the ONR ABC and the RNR, a small faction of the umbrella ONR was birthed, called the Ruch Nationalistów Polskich Zadruga, or the Movement of Polish Nationalists Zadruga. Created by Jan Stachniuk in 1937, the RNPZ was a group that advocated for union with all Western Slavs under a single centralized neo-pagan state. While membership was minuscule, having only about 300 followers by 1939, it was the largest of the many similar neo-pagan organizations within Poland. During the war, Stachniuk fought in the AK while leading the RNPZ and publishing his philosophical works for the movement under the pseudonym Stoiganev. After the war, the group published the Zriv and Arkona journals to spread their ideologies. In 1949, the leaders of the RNPZ were arrested by the new communist government and released in 1936 as the result of an amnesty treaty, moving their operations to Wrocław and becoming more of an intellectual group as opposed to a political one. In the years leading up to and following the fall of communism in Poland, the group's followers attempted to revive it, but these attempts were in vain, as they failed, and it's still dead. Back to the ONR factions, the RNR and the ABC were each rebranded during wartime. In 1940, the RNR formed into the Konfederacja Narodu, or the Confederation of the Nation, with the help of several smaller resistance groups. Due to ideological differences, it was separate from the government in exile. Despite this, the KN would merge with the ZWZ in part in 1941, and the remaining members would merge with the AK in late 1943 after failing to attract major backing throughout the war. The ONR ABC formed Grupa Janka, or Rampart Group, in the early days of the war. They were also opposed to the government in exile, and were a separate entity from it for the most part. In 1944, it took a portion of the NSZ that did not take part in the 1944 merger with the AK. As the war began to enter its final months, the GS began to prioritize anti-Soviet operations over anti-German, even collaborating with the Nazis on some occasions to fight the Soviets. The greatest example of this would be the Brigada Świętokrzyska, or the Holy Cross Mountain Brigade. After the war, the GS continued anti-Soviet resistance until the majority of its members members were forced into hiding by 1947. In 1993, a group of Polish nationalists re-established the ONR, that is the self-proclaimed successor to the interwar ONR, still believing in and advocating for many of the same ideals. However, the current ONR is not a designated political party, but rather a political organization. As such, it is regularly described as a fascist and neo-Nazi organization, with even the Polish Supreme Court officially branding them as fascist in 2021. At the time I am writing this, an estimated member count is unknown. The last of the four main Polish political parties in the PPP was the Stronnictwo Pracy, or the Labor faction. The SP was founded by Wojciech Karfanty and Karol Popiel in October 1937 after the merger of the Polskie Stronnictwo Chrześcijańskie Democracy, the Polish Christian Democracy Party, Narodowa Partia Robotnicza, the National Workers' Party, and Związek Halerzyków, the Halerzyk Union, with Karfanty being its first leader. The party followed policies of Christian democracy and conservatism. It was a firm opponent to the Senation-led government of the time, wishing for a democratic parliamentary system with Catholic influence. While the party did not seem to hold its own military wing, it did, however, have two of its members be chosen to lead the civilian branch of the government in exile, being Cyril Ratajski from 1940 to 1942, and Jan Jankowski from 1943 to 1945. This position, the Delegate Raju na Kraj, or government delegate for Poland, was nearly equivalent to the role of prime minister. After the war, a communist leading faction within the SP gained the majority of the party and took over control. It was merged with the sanctioned Stronnictwo Demokratyczne, or Democratic Party, in 1950, and would remain so until the fall of communism. The SP was re-established as the Chrześcijańsko-Demokratyczne Stronnictwo Pracy, the Christian Democratic Labor Party, in 1989, and formally registered the next year. It returned to its former name in 2000. The SP currently has an unknown member count and no seats in either the Senate or the Sejm. Notable events. Throughout the war, there were thousands of underground missions taken on by the Poles that the PPP were either directly or indirectly involved with, as well as many acts of defiance against the Nazi-Soviet occupation that the PPP had no involvement in at all. While I obviously cannot mention every single one, as much as I would like to, I will discuss a few from each year of the war in somewhat chronological order, and some that took place in the years after the war against the new communist government. They would range from mass operations against the occupying forces to one-time engagements involving no more than a couple hundred people each, and some acts of civilian resistance as opposed to armed combat. 1939. Given that the war as a whole had begun in September 1939, the year was in its last month, so fairly little happened in that 4-month time frame compared to the following years. On October 8th, in the city of Piotrków Trybunalski, about 80 miles southwest of Warszawa, the first Jewish ghetto was set up, imprisoning some 25,000 people from the surrounding area. During its liquidation, approximately 22,000 of the ghetto's population were sent to concentration camps in Treblinka and Majdanek, while those that remained were, in most cases, executed outright on a pretty frequent basis. Other prominent ghettos established during 1939 include Otwock, Płock, and Puławy. Each ghetto was assigned a Judenrat, or a head council of sorts, run by Jews selected by the Nazis to oversee the ghetto and make sure the day-to-day functions of it are sufficient. Throughout the war, hundreds of ghettos would be established across the annexed north, the general government, the rest of the eastern Reichskommissariats and occupied lands. In early November, shortly after the establishment of the general government, cavalry commander Witold Pilecki, Major Jan Włodarkiewicz, and artillery commander Władysław Stamraki created the Tajna Armia Polska, or the Secret Polish Army. It was an armed resistance group made up primarily of Polish soldiers and a small number of non-soldiers. It held approximately 300 members by late 1940 when it merged with the KN. During the existence of the TAP, it primarily worked in counterintelligence and security, pinpointing local troop movements and acting as guardsmen for meetings between resistance leaders. The TAP would be a vital cornerstone in the foundation of what would become a massive underground Polish intel network spanning across the nation. Around this time, Major Dobrzański would also begin his guerrilla activities with the Oddział Wydzielony Wojska Polskiego until his aforementioned 1940 death in combat, primarily including a successful ambush of a German convoy just north of the Góry Świętokrzyski. There were a number of underground Polish newspapers established in the first few months. These included Bulletin Informacyjny and Nowy Kurier Warszawski. 1940. The first full year of war for Poland was full of resistance activity within the country. A group of Polish high school students chose to kick off the year by attempting to storm and occupy a Red Army base and prison in the town of Chortkov in what is now western Ukraine. After noticing a decrease in Soviet garrisons in the area due to some troops being sent to fight Finland in the Winter War, the students began plotting their attack. On the night of January 21st, anywhere from 100 to 250 Poles gathered in the local church and finalized their attack plan, which included dividing up into 4 groups, each tasked with different orders, from capturing the army barracks and prison to blowing up a nearby train station to delay Soviet reinforcements and supply. The attack began at 10 p.m. The Polish fighters had a number of disadvantages, as they had heavily underestimated the Soviet presence that remained in the area, as well as the fact that the majority of the Poles lacked guns, with many unarmed entirely, while others relied on anything from kitchen knives to medieval swords. As a result, the Soviets swiftly defeated the Poles after a short shootout that left 14 resistance fighters and 3 Red Army soldiers dead and the rest of the resistance fleeing. The day after the fight, an NKVD detachment rounded up approximately 150 civilians, many of whom were falsely accused of being participants, and arrested them, with around 20 to 30 being tortured during interrogations. Many of those who were arrested were either exiled to Siberia or just murdered outright. In the months following the Povstanie Wartowski, the Soviets clamped down in the area, with many of the Polish prisoners in the Chortów prison being massacred through April and May as a small portion of what became known as the Katyn massacre. Numerous ghettos were established throughout the year, including the 2 biggest and most well-known, the Łódź ghetto in February with around 200,000 people, and the Warsaw ghetto in October, holding over twice that at 450,000 people. Since most of the population were unarmed and unable to physically fight back, resistance activity was more symbolic during the ghetto era, primarily consisting of maintaining local and Jewish tradition wherever possible, as well as just overall trying to live as close to normal day-to-day lives as possible. Many buildings were converted into schools, and secret gatherings would take place where prayers and religious activities were held. There were also a number of radios that had not been discovered and confiscated by the Nazis, so the Jews used them to keep aware of the war situation, both within Poland itself as well as abroad. When food rations decreased, or the already poor worker conditions were threatened, many groups would go on strike until either the German authorities gave in to their demands or the strikers were suppressed. The local Judenrats, while under the thumb of the Nazis, would regularly assist the Jews in their efforts, illegally documenting the events via writing and photographs. The Warsaw Ghetto in particular, due to both the high population and being situated in the Polish capital, was highly restricted, and anything going in and out of it was extremely monitored. As such, outside information that was not German propaganda was incredibly scarce, if not completely void. Throughout 1940 and 1941, members of the Jewish Socialist Party and Zionist Labor Movement, 2 small organizations within the ghetto, collaborated to publish an underground newspaper using what little information they could receive. It did not, however, call for any armed struggle against the occupiers, as the groups behind them were unable to supply weaponry, but it did give some idea of the general scales of destruction and resistance outside the gates. In March, Hubel's men decimated a battalion of Wehrmacht forces outside the Silesian village of Husiska. As a response, the combined force of both Wehrmacht and SS forces, totaling a minimum of 8,000 men, were stationed in the area to hunt down the OWWP. This culminated in late April when the OWWP and German garrisons engaged one another in a ravine, resulting in Hubel's death and the eventual disbandment of the OWWP in June. Witold Pilecki was voluntarily arrested by German forces and sent to the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. His plan was to go undercover in the camp under a false identity to build up a resistance group within it, as well as to report back to the ZWZ what the conditions in the camp were like and how the prisoners were treated within. Pilecki, under the false identity of Tomasz Serafiński, a different officer who was presumed dead, would begin reporting on the inner workings of the camp in October, and would establish the Wyścig Organizacji Wojskowej, or the Military Union Organization, which he would use to recruit other inmates for a resistance movement within the camp. During his time in the camp, Pilecki was promoted to the rank of Porucznik, which is pretty much the Polish equivalent of a first lieutenant, or lieutenant for the maybe 3 tea drinkers in the audience. He also overcame a bout of severe pneumonia, as sanitary was about as widespread as the people who genuinely like Black Ops 7. Easily probably the worst Black Ops game that I've played in a fucking hell of a long time. Call me biased. Best COD game, in my opinion, is World War II, and I will fucking die on this hill. Anyway, what the fuck was I on about? ZOW had a number of important uses, including secretly supplying members with extra supplies, such as clothing and food, as well as acquiring outside intel coming into the camp and sending intel from in the camp outside the camp to the government in exile, and most notably, the creation of a force with the end goal of revolting and liberating the camp if such an opportunity were to present itself, and upon approval from the government in exile to do so. Intel sharing began in late 1940. Before the operation began, Auschwitz was not believed to be a death camp, but rather a military prison. It was only after Pilecki's reports began coming out that the true nature of the facility was revealed. It was uncovered that the camp was max executing many of the prisoners, the vast majority of them being Jews. Pilecki's reports were among the first to depict in detail the immense scale of what became known as the Holocaust in the years following the war's end. In return, the ZOW would receive outside reports of any current resistance activity in the area and throughout the country. They would also get updates on the overall war situation and any possible plans of an outside attack on the camp, which, if some were to happen, the ZOW was to begin their interior rebellion simultaneously. 1941. Over a 7-month time frame starting in late 1940, the ZOW constructed a radio out of scrap and pieces of electronics that had been smuggled into Auschwitz. It became a key component in getting intel out of the camp and into the hands of the government in exile. Around this time, the first batches of the aforementioned info about the Holocaust was sent out. During the duration, Allied intelligence used the ZOW as the sole source of information regarding the genocide. In early March, Polish actor and known Nazi collaborator Karol Juliusz Sim was shot and killed by a resistance fighter posing as a mailman at his home in Warsaw. Sim was a target of the resistance since the beginning of the year at the latest. He had been working with the Gestapo since before the war began, aiding in capturing other Polish film stars and helping produce many propaganda films, with the German film Heimkehr probably being his most notable wartime work, during which he served as primary caster, successfully coercing a number of Polish actors to contribute. The film was released in October, just over 7 months after Sim's death. Shortly after the onset of Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, the government in exile began attempting to restore relations with the USSR, with heavy encouragement from British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, 1st Earl of Avon. This resulted in the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement, named after General Sikorsky and Ivan Maysky, the Soviet ambassador to the UK. In the treaty, Moscow agreed to nullify all past treaties with Berlin, including the territory granted to them by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They also agreed to release thousands of Polish POWs and allow Polish General Władysław Anders to create a unit of Polish soldiers within Soviet territory, which became the Dwa Korpus Polski, or Polish Second Corps, also referred to as Anders' Army. Some of you may recognize that name. Yes, these are the Wojtek people. As a result of the treaty, Eastern resistance priorities shifted from anti-Soviet to anti-German. Plus, since there wasn't really any Soviet-occupied Polish lands by the end of the year, they couldn't really do much against Moscow for the time being. In the opening months of Barbarossa, many resistance fighters focused increased sabotage efforts along German supply lines, such as railroads and important railways. In December, many Jews trapped in the Vilno ghetto in modern-day Vilnius, Lithuania, held a less active and more symbolic resistance by openly calling for the ghetto, and by extension all Jews under Nazi occupation, to fight back against their occupiers, both symbolically and physically. 1942. The Vilno ghetto built up a proper resistance group in January, the Vereinigte Partisaner Organizace, or the United Partisan Organization, made up primarily of Polish, Lithuanian, and Estonian Jews. Their primary goal initially was to send out to the Allies reports of the Lithuanian branch of the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jewish population there. They had made an agreement with the local Judenrat that, in exchange for support, the FPO would not interfere with the Judenrat or the ghetto's overall routines. Down in Auschwitz, some ZOW members had become untrustworthy and posed a threat of alerting the guards of their radio's existence. So the radio that they built the year before was subsequently hidden and dismantled. Luckily for Pilecki and his men, before the radio was removed, they were able to get a considerable amount of intel out to the government in exile and the rest of the Allies. And there was the assumption that the Allies would use this information to perform some sort of air raid into the camp to either supply the inmates with munitions or send a force of paratroopers to liberate it. Many of the eastern ghettos began liquidation in the latter half of the year, given that the Eastern Front was beginning to deteriorate for the Germans later on. For example, during the liquidation of the Piotrków Trybunalski ghetto, approximately 22,000 of the ghetto's population were sent to concentration camps at Treblinka and Majdanek, while those that remained were, in most cases, executed outright in a surprisingly frequent basis. 1943. The first quarter of 1943 was surprisingly very good for the resistance. The AK received interior intel from a couple Poles working as janitors at the Reserverschutzanstalt Peenemünde. Through these leaks, the Allies were able to map out the facility and soon learn vital information regarding the V-2 rocket, which, while making the script, I learned that I'm a distant relative of Werner von Braun, the lead scientist behind the rocket. Wasn't expecting that, but I'll go with it. The hopes of the Allies dropping in weapons and or paratroopers in to liberate the camp never came to fruition, and as a result, Pilecki and 2 other inmates chose to escape Auschwitz-Birkenau during a night shift outside the camp's gates. By incapacitating the guard watching over them, the three men cut both a telephone wire and an alarm and ran off into the night, eventually reaching a safe house near the town of Bochina. In their destination resides some irony, however, as the safe house commander was one Tomasz Serafinsky, the same officer who Pilecki had impersonated upon his arrival to the camp. For 3 months, Serafinsky and his wife housed Pilecki and the men he escaped with. It was here where Pilecki wrote a highly detailed and in-depth report on what went on within the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The report was buried in Serafinsky's yard, where it remained until after Pilecki's death. He also wrote Rapport V, another collection of documents about the camp and its inner workings. I will add a link to an English version of it in the description if you wish to skip through it yourself. But be aware that it is incredibly long, so definitely not something you'd want to read while eating your morning breakfast. Back in Warsaw, the Jews locked up in the ghetto had finally reached their boiling point. Over the past months, many hidden bunkers and defenses were constructed within the ghetto, as well as an influx of high amounts of weapons as a result of the Grossaktion Warschau, a roundup of nearly 250,000 Jews to be deported to Treblinka in mid-1942. After a minor skirmish and partial victory in January, the Powstanie w Getcie Warszawskim, or the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, began on April 19th, after SS Brigadeführer Ferdinand von Sachsen-Frankenegg ordered the ghetto to be liquidated and its buildings demolished. At approximately 3 a.m., a column of SS soldiers went through the streets with the loudspeaker, ordering the Jews out of the buildings and to prepare for transport to an undisclosed location. The column was instead attacked by Jewish partisans with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and gunfire. A second column was ambushed elsewhere in the ghetto around the same time. Later that morning, due to his inability to quickly put down the partisans, Heinrich Himmler replaced von Sachsen-Frankenegg with Jürgen Stroop. The Jews rejected an ultimatum delivered to them the next day. Over the coming days, hundreds of Jewish prisoners, many of which uninvolved with the uprising, were executed and entire city blocks were demolished. During the fighting within the ghetto, detachments from the AK joined in, led by Captain Josef Kowalski Pijani, attempting to alleviate the German presence as well as breach the ghetto walls with explosives. Unfortunately, the attempt to reinforce the Jews in the end failed. On the 25th, a band of partisans attempting to leave the ghetto were intercepted by an SS patrol and massacred. It was the bloodiest loss of life the Jews sustained in a single engagement during the uprising. The AK received the final call from within the ghetto the next day, sent out by high command from the headquarters of the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, or the Jewish Cabinet Organization, one of the two primary partisan groups in the uprising, the other being the Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, or the Jewish Military Union. The report read as follows: For 8 days now, we have been engaged in a deadly battle. The Germans suffered numerous losses. The first 2 days they were forced to retreat. Later on, they had reinforcements brought in, including tanks, armored cars, artillery, and even planes that came into action for the planned siege. Our losses, i.e. victims of fusillades and fires in which men, women, and children were killed, are very significant. Our last days are approaching, but we will continue to fight and to resist as long as we hold weapons in our hands. On May 8th, as the SS were surrounding the ZOB, most of the uprising leaders committed suicide. One, Marek Edelman, managed to escape a couple days later along with a few others. Edelman would stay in the city itself and take part in the Warsaw Uprising the next year. He went on to live until 2009, being buried with full military honors in Warsaw in October of that year. In the middle of the night on May 13th to 14th, a squadron of Soviet bombers attacked German positions in and around the city, with some bombs landing in or around the ghetto. Many Jews engaged the Germans during the bombing raids, and others attempted to escape the ghetto while the enemy soldiers were unable to act. However, only a small percentage of the fleeing Jews actually made it out of the ghetto walls, but many continued their efforts throughout the days after the bombing. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising ended on May 16th, just under a month after it had begun. The Germans had sustained only about 100 to 300 casualties, whereas according to German estimates, so they are probably over-exaggerated, over 56,000 Jews were executed or deported to concentration camps across Poland, primarily Treblinka and Majdanek. Only about 300 of those were actual Jewish partisans. The Jews knew from the beginning that their revolt would be crushed sooner or later, but still chose to fight as a show of force against and to send a message to the Nazis that they will not dictate when, where, or how the Jews of Europe will die. Starting in mid-1943 and going until mid-1944, the AK performed a number of assassinations of many notable Nazis throughout Poland in Operacja Główki, or Operation Heads. The many targets of the specific operation were high-ranking officers of the Wehrmacht, SS, and Gestapo, who were sentenced to death by the government in exile for crimes against humanity and the Polish people. Some of the 1943 assassinations included SS Obersturmführer Herbert Schulz on May 6th, his colleague SS Rotenführer Ewald Lange 2 weeks later on May 22nd, and SS Oberscharführer Franz Berkel on September 7th during a shootout in Warsaw. Many of the killings sparked brutal German retaliation. During the fight that led to Berkel's death, for example, about 8 Germans were killed in the engagement with the AK, whereas none of the partisans died. The local authorities publicly executed around 20 Polish citizens as a result of the killings, none of which were involved in any way with the assassination. 1944. By New Year's Day in 1944, the Red Army was quickly reapproaching the Polish-Soviet border. The Ukrainian, Belarusian SSRs were being liberated at a very fast rate following the Soviet victory in the Battle of Kursk the previous summer, and Berlin's grip on the entire Eastern Theater, Poland included, was turning into an increasingly dire situation. This, among other things, led to an increase in important Nazi officials' lifetime subscriptions being cancelled. In the late morning on February 1st, as part of Operacja Głowki, SS Brigadeführer und SS und Polizeiführer Warschau Franz Kuchera was ambushed and assassinated by partisans of the group Pegaz after the government in exile ordered his death for crimes against the Polish people. He was intercepted while entering the SS headquarters in the city. During the immediate engagement, Kuchera was shot once by one of the Poles and then shot in the head by Michael Mish Ishayevich. The next day, approximately 300 civilians were executed in reprisal, including 100 near the assassination site and 200 in the former Warsaw Ghetto. From May to June, a series of engagements between resistance fighters and German-led forces took place. The largest of these took place on the evening of May 13th, going into the morning hours of May 14th. The Battle of Murowana Uziemianka was fought between the AK and the Lietuvos Vietinė Rinktinė, or the Lithuanian Territorial Defense Force, a unit created in the Reichskommissariat Ostland meant to defend against the Soviet advance. Despite being outnumbered, the some 600 Poles successfully routed and defeated the LVR detachment of about 750. The LVR was disarmed the following day, and multiple soldiers and officers were executed for their inability to deal with the partisans. The next primary skirmish occurred on June 14th, when anywhere from 25 to 30,000 Wehrmacht troops engaged a joint Soviet-Polish partisan force of around 3,000 at the Battle of Paritovo-Vyshgorje. Due to the regular disruptions with the German supply lines, a plan was set to clear any resistance in the region surrounding the Janov Forest, dubbed Sturmwind. Using tanks, aircraft, and artillery, the partisan lines were broken numerous times, but by the end of the day, the majority of German gains had been retaken, resulting in a victory for the resistance fighters, who, under the cover of night, retreated back into the woods. The success of the fight was short-lived, however, as a German counterattack came later that month at the Battle of Osuchi, dubbed Sturmwind II, where the original goal of clearing out resistance activity was achieved. During the duo of battles, a combined total of around 600 resistance fighters were killed, along with a minimum estimate of 1,200 German forces. As summer began to wrap up, the Poles chose to take on the Nazis once again in a pre-planned coordinated rebellion. Throughout the past years, the AK and government in exile have been secretly preparing for a nationwide uprising, where thousands of Poles from all walks of life would take up arms and finally rid their country of German forces. They would assist their Western allies to not only defeat the Reich and her allies, but to restore a democratically led, capitalist Polish state aligned with the West in the post-war climate. The plan for such an undertaking was temporarily halted as the Red Army approached the Polish border in late 43 into 44. Originally intended to be supported by Soviet men and equipment, Polish-Soviet relations were still in the shitter, so assistance of any kind from Moscow was next to impossible, and it was incredibly unlikely that there would be a rogue Soviet soldier willing to hand his items to a random Pole. The new plan, dubbed Akcja Burzha, or Operation Tempest, or Operation Burzha, was to be ongoing throughout the year. The plan was that the AK would rise up in important Polish cities under German control and liberate them as the Wehrmacht was evacuating west from the advancing Red Army. Beginning in the eastern Woyen Voivodeship, the AK began Akcja Burzha by establishing the 27 Wojenska Dywizja Piechoty under the command of Pułkownik Jan Wojciech Kiwerski, who would command the unit until his death in April. Skirmishing with multiple Soviet German detachments, the unit escaped to Lublin in June and assisted in the Lublin uprising in July. Other uprisings in the operation around the same time included Operacja Ostra Brama in Vilno, the Powstanie Lwowskie in Lwów, as well as uprisings in Łódź, Radom, Kielce, and Białystok, among others. There was an uprising planned for Krakow, the capital city of the general government, for August, but it was cancelled for numerous reasons. However, numerous AK units were created in and around the city and sent throughout the country. The pinnacle of Akcja Burzha began in Warsaw on August 1st. A primary goal of the operation as a whole was to liberate the Polish capital before the Soviets arrived. which the government in exile could then return to and be seen as the legitimate Polish government over the increasing probability of a Soviet-influenced communist government. The Red Army arrived in the eastern banks of the Vistula River, cutting through the city on July 29th. It was decided that the partisans either had to rise up then and now or lose any chances of a post-war Poland free of Soviet influence. At the 17th hour, or 5 p.m. for those who can't comprehend numbers past 12 on a clock, on August 1st, anywhere from 25 to 50,000 Poles rose up in the western half of Warsaw in the Powstanie Warszawskie, or the Warsaw Uprising. Led by General Tadeusz Komorowski, the resistance was up against approximately 16,700 Wehrmacht and SS troops, as well as numerous detachments of auxiliaries and German paramilitary groups. The AK managed to capture many strategic spots throughout the city, including Śród-Mieści and Zolibroz. By August 4th, the resistance had liberated most of the city. Some areas, such as the Wola district, were exceptionally difficult areas to take if they were able to be taken at all, resulting in heavy casualties for the resistance. The Germans began reinforcing their lines around this time, and overall command was transferred to SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski. The Geshiovka prison was liberated by the Poles on August 5th, with many of the primarily Jewish prisoners joining their ranks. Throughout the fighting, the Poles managed to capture many pieces of German equipment to use against them. These include many guns, support equipment such as grenades, armored cars, half-tracks, and even a couple Panzerfünf Panther tanks. Other than capturing German supplies, the Poles were also being airdropped supplies from the US, UK, and to a much lesser extent, the USSR. It was originally planned for the Soviets to cross the Vistula and directly assist the AK, but General Konstantin Rokossovsky refused, as doing so would be seen as a sign of backing the government in exile. With the ever-increasing number of losses the resistance was sustaining as the days were piling on, the Poles were in desperate need of a morale boost. This came in primarily the form of song, with partisans regularly singing and performing Polish songs amongst each other, with the most notable of these being written during the uprising as a poem by AK soldier and poet Józef Krzyżanowski, named Chłopcy silni jak stal, or The Boys as Strong as Steel. By the end of September, much of the Polish gains had been reversed, and the uprising was more or less crushed. On October 7th, Komorowski met with von dem Bach-Zelewski. The next day, a treaty between the two was signed, formally ending the Powstanie Warszawskie as a German victory and the crushing defeat for the government in exile. Approximately 16,000 German soldiers were killed, whereas over twice that were either killed or captured on the Polish side, just in terms of resistance fighters. Around 200,000 civilians were also killed during the fighting. In the aftermath, most of the Poles that took part in the fighting were sent to POW in concentration camps, and the entire rest of the city's population were deported to the west, but most were neither arrested nor executed. Komorowski was appointed Polish commander-in-chief a day before the rising ended. Despite the humiliation of Warsaw and numerous demands from the government in exile, he refused to call off the remaining partisan groups throughout the rest of Poland, and Akcja Burza continued on a much smaller scale until January of 1945. On New Year's Eve, a selected group of Poles, who had been tasked by Moscow earlier in the year, created the Raja Timaszowi Rzeczypospolitej Polski, or the Provisional Government of the Republic of Poland. It was done in order to create a Soviet-backed government within Poland, so it would be seen as a legitimate government over the government in exile, which, as a reminder, had been running from London ever since the fall of France. 1945. By the time 1945 came around, it was clear that Germany had only a few months left at most. The Soviets were days away from entering East Prussia, and the Western Allies were now within the German borders, as the Battle of the Bulge began to go horribly for Berlin. In January, the AK was formally disbanded, as keeping it around could cause post-war tension, which, given the fragile state in any nation after being occupied for almost 6 years, may run the risk of causing a civil war. It was also done to keep the government in exile out of a direct conflict with the Red Army. However, even though the organization was gone, it did not stop most of the partisans from continuing to fight on. Most resistance acts by this point were against the Soviets as opposed to against the Germans, since by this time the Red Army was in control of the vast majority of Polish territory. There was still some sporadic acts of sabotage and vandalism against the Germans, but there was little active engagement. Many organizations with specifically anti-communism in mind were formed, such as the Zrzeszenie Wolność i Niepodległość, or the Freedom of Independence Association. The resistance fighters who continued to fight the Soviets became known after the war as Żołnierze Wyklęci, or Cursed Soldiers. In March, a delegate of partisans with ties to the government in exile were invited to a conference held by the RTRP, under the assumption that they would be offered positions within the new government. This was all a farce, however, as the delegates, along with others, a combined total of 16 people, were arrested by the NKVD. The Poles were given a show trial with the Proces Sieznatsu, or Trial of the 16, where they were convicted of acting against the Soviets, including cooperation with the Nazis. In June, they were all given varying prison sentences, with most eventually being released and immigrating out of Poland. Those who didn't either died in custody or were executed by the Soviets. Throughout the last days of the war, the resistance liberated multiple prisons and holding facilities, including a small Nazi concentration camp in Holishovo being liberated by remnants of the NSZ on May 5th, and an NKVD barracks being hit on the 7th. Post-war, May 8th, 1945. Berlin has fallen. Hitler and nearly all of his inner circle are either dead or in hiding. The Allies occupy nearly all of Germany proper, and the spirit of the Reich is shattered. Basically, they fucked around a bit too much, and as a result, found out real damn hard, real damn fast. The war in Europe is over. However, the destruction from the nearly 6-year-long struggle still remains, and it will for the next many years. Millions of people lie dead across the European countryside, and hundreds of thousands of homes, stores, factories, etc. are scorched, collapsed, and riddled with bullets. Despite all of this, one thing remained: the Polish resolve. The resistance movement did not just lay down their arms upon the German surrender. They had a new foe to face: the communists. The provisional government successfully installed itself in Warsaw, and was quickly seen as the legitimate Polish government. The partisans saw this as nothing more than the German occupiers being replaced by Soviet occupiers. As a result, many partisans and underground organizations continued to fight against the provisional government. The first major engagement in the post-war period was the Obława Augustowska, or the Augustov Roundup. In mid-July, the NKV arrested over 2,000 Poles in northeastern Poland, near the new border with the Lithuanian and Belarusian SSRs, agreed on by the major allies at the Potsdam Conference. Around 600 of the Poles were deported, and the rest were executed. Today, it is known in Poland as Little Katyn, after the 1940 Katyn massacre, and it is considered the largest Soviet-directed crime against post-war Poland. The provisional government formalized their rule by creating the Rzeczpospolita Polska, or the Republic of Poland, in 1947, after a rigged election where the communists easily won control of the government. The government in exile was, by this point, only recognized by a select few nations. By 1946, all three major Western allies, the US, the UK, and France, had withdrawn their recognition of the government in exile. Throughout the entire Cold War period, the government in exile continued to exist, mostly as a symbol of the resistance, but they never again held any true power within the Polish state. Back on the home front, post-war resistance acts primarily consisted of raiding supply depots and facilities of the NKVD, and the new Polish secret police, the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, or the security office. The WIN would also regularly attack prisons holding political opponents, freeing hundreds in the process. Many of the high-ranking leaders of the resistance, both during and after the war, were arrested by the Soviets, and many were given show trials. For example, Witold Pilecki was arrested in May 1947 by the UB and was sentenced to death on charges of espionage, illegally crossing the border, and plotting numerous assassinations on Soviet and Polish officials. He was executed with a single gunshot to the head on May 25th, 1948, in the infamous Więzienie Mokotowskie. In the following years, as the scars of war slowly began to heal, active resistance activity slowly ceased, with no major events after 1954, with the renaming of Poland into the Polska Rzeczpospolita Ludowa, or the Polish People's Republic 2 years earlier, which it would remain as until the fall of communism in the late 1980s. The government in exile, having lost all international recognition by 1972, with the Vatican City being the final country to withdraw recognition, formally handed their responsibilities over to the new post-communist government on December 22nd, 1990, and finalizing its dissolution on New Year's Eve of 1991. Well, that took way too long to write. As I say during the videos on Irish history, if someone watching this video speaks Polish and would like to critique my probably shit pronunciations, feel free. I welcome the constructive criticism, and it would be fun to chuckle at comparisons between how a word should be pronounced and how I butchered it. Again, all of the research and time that goes into these videos is all solo, and I am nowhere near professional at any of it. So if I said something that was incorrect to an extent, or just flat out wrong in its entirety, please feel free to correct me in the comments, as it would not only help out myself, but also anyone else watching the video. Make sure to share this video with any friends and family that you may have that are also fans of history. Also, go and check out the Discord server that I have. There isn't a whole lot of activity going on currently, but I hope to change that as more people show up. Also, take a look at my Twitch channel, where I occasionally stream with Undead and some other friends, as well as the Nightmarecast channel, where myself, Undead, and some other friends and family would just yap and be dumbasses for a little bit. I promise I'm trying to get the idiots together to make something for it. Carve, I blame you. So that being said, mam na imię Kage I dziękujemy za uwagę.